to give you some context, the circus was by far the most popular form of popular entertainment in the United States up until about 1910. And really, I mean, it just by far, more people by far attended circuses than any other form of entertainment in the late 19th century. And it's considered, the last quarter of the 19th century is considered kind of a golden age of the circus, and that's when the Sells brothers came up. Their timing was good. Over here on the monitors is a picture of the three that continued in the business. There was a fourth brother named Ad Sells who left the firm in the early 1880s and opened a hotel of all things in Topeka. And these are the three that managed it since, you know, after that time. To show what a big deal the circus was, think in terms of like Paramount Pictures being located in Columbus. And that's what Sells Brothers was to this. It was really, when they were at their peak, they were the third largest circus in the United States behind Barnum and, it was called Barnum and London at the time, although, you know, James A. Bailey was still a partner of Barnum's at that time. Also, the other one was Adam Forepaugh, who his circus plays a part in the Sells story. So the first 2 years the show was out was 1870. Well, the first contact with the circus business that the Sells brothers had was in 1867, that they went in with a partnership with a guy named James T. Johnston in Iowa, and they put together a winter circus there that was a failure. As many of you know, the Sells brothers they grew up in Columbus. They had a big farm near Dublin, and the family moved to Cleveland for a while in the 1850s and then moved back to Columbus. And they got into the auction business, and an uncle got them involved in that. And what they realized pretty quickly was they'd take all this stuff around and where there was a crowd, like they'd go to fairs and things like that, but they'd also go to circuses because they would draw big crowds to cities. And that's how they got involved in the circus business, and I think they observed it from that. And they got, you know, as I said, they had that first taste in 1867 that didn't go well. And then in 1872, they started again, and they put their show in the behind where the Neal House used to be downtown. And the funny thing is, the first 2 years, it was called the Paul Silverberg Circus. And I have no idea why they did that. And I've looked into that a little bit, and it just completely baffles me. And then from 1874 to 1877, they called the show the Great European Zoological Institute. And this is a piece of stationery from that show from 1876. And then in 1878, they really went in the big time, that they bought a circus that had gone broke and went on the railroad track. And they had 32 railroad cars that were about anywhere between 45 and 50 feet long. And they owned 7 elephants on the show, and that was the largest number of elephants that was on any circus at that time. Now, there had been a show in the 1850s that had 10, but that was kind of an anomaly. And so they just really advertised that having the 7 elephants, and that was a big deal. Now, what was really important about them going on the railroad track is that they could skip the small towns and just play to bigger cities, which would be more lucrative and would have more of an audience to attract. And when it was a wagon show, you could only go about 15 miles a night. And what you do is, in Ohio, for example, the average size of a county in Ohio is 454 square miles, which is nominally about 21 and a half miles north and south and east and west. And so what they would do generally, counties were the size they were, because it would take if you were on the border of the county, to get to the county seat would be about 10 to 13 miles. And so they were always located in the center. So what Sells Brothers would do is they would play the county seat, and then there'd generally be another small town that would be on the border between counties, and then they'd play there, and then the next day they'd go and play the next county seat. Well, when they got to the railroads, they could go as much as 100, 150 miles a night, And although that would be a pretty big jump, the train would go about 25 miles an hour. But when they were able to do that, they were able to play to much bigger crowds. And this was an important development in the history of the American circus because of the geography. This is when the American circus took a different tact than European circuses, which were always one ring shows. What happened is that they realized when they play in these bigger towns, they needed bigger tents. And eventually, in 1873, the first circus went to 2 rings. And then in 1881, 2 circuses went to 3 rings. Now, Sells Brothers stayed at 1 ring until 1881, and then they went to 2 rings. But this is when, as I said, the American circus really diverged from European circuses. And what you see is prior to the 1870s, the emphasis of circus was on the quality of the performance and the ability of the performers. And a lot of the performers, including ones that were on the Sells Brothers, were household names at the time. And again, nobody remembers any of these names, but people like Dan Rice and James Robinson and Isaac Van Amberg and Jacob Driesbach. I mean, these were household names at the time. And the Sells Brothers had, a number of them like that. And so this emphasis on the quality of the act and the emphasis on the individual performers, that began to change as circuses got bigger, and they became quantitative rather. And by that I mean they would talk about, again, this is an example of it. It's not that they had the best elephants, that they had the most. And it was the difference between a qualitative presentation and a quantitative. And that's all just a result of the American geography. Moving along. Now this is a picture of the show in about 1905, after, we'll get into this in a little bit, but after they had combined with the Adam Forepaugh Circus. And you can see, I don't know how many, there were like a dozen or so, 15 elephants, and you can see some of these other wagons. But the thing I want you to see is look how big that tent is. And you could put the entire Ohio State football field, under that tent. Okay, now this is an interesting photo. This again is from about 1904, and it's after they had combined with the Forepaugh Circus. The man that's the closest to the elephant is a fellow named Bill Badger, who's an African American. And he was really extraordinary for the time. He was the elephant boss. He was in charge of the elephants on Sells Brothers Circus for a number of years, and was probably one of the very few African Americans that supervised European Americans during that period. He was really considered one of the premier elephant guys in the country. And in fact, the Sells Brothers Circus was, I don't know that I would say they were like liberal by today's standards, but they were for that period, because a lot of circuses wouldn't hire African Americans, and they did. And in fact, besides Badger, in 1880, the Sells Brothers Circus had the first sideshow band that was all black. And one of the things that's interesting about that became very common, and they're the ones that started it. But there's been a lot of some new scholarship about jazz and Dixieland music and all this. And it used to be that people thought, historians and scholars thought that the way that the black music got transferred to the white audience was through records. And there's been a few books that have been written in the last few years that say that white people heard African American music at circuses and minstrel shows. So the circus, the agency of that, goes back to the circus, and that was an important, one of many cultural legacies of the circus. This is what's called an advance car, and this is from 1878, and I'm sure they were very, very proud to have this. And this train car would have maybe 20 guys that would live on it, and they'd go from town to town like 3 weeks ahead of the circus, and then they'd disperse every day and put posters up all around the other towns. And it was pretty common practice back then. If circuses, there's always a problem with circuses if they got into each other's territory, and it was a pretty common thing for circuses to tear down the posters of another circus and put up their own, and all kinds of things like that would be considered really, obviously it was illegal, but they were really, the government cities and counties and stuff, they didn't really pay any attention to it. But it's kind of funny because some circuses that didn't allow any kind of gambling or anything like that on the show, like the Barnum and Bailey Circus and the Ringling Brothers Circus, they didn't think twice about covering people's paper. And you know, there's cases where they'd have to leave a guy in the town to keep from the other show coming in to follow it up. And you know, this is a good example of it. And Sells Brothers went through a huge billing war with another circus in 1878 in Illinois. Okay, now, as I said, in 1878 they went on the railroad track, and what they did with their wagon show equipment was they put out a second unit, and they called it various things up until 1882. The first year they did it was in 78, and then in 1882 their second show, which was much smaller, it was on about 20 cars, 20 railroad cars as opposed to the 30, 35 that Sells was on, was this S.H. Barrett. And Sheldon Barrett married one of the sisters of the Sells brothers and was very active in the firm until he died in 1900. And this gives you a kind of an idea. They really did this on the circus. Can you imagine this? And you know, a lot of people died when they would try and act like this. This is now they're calling it the Cuman cannonball, but it's really a catapult. And you know, the same thing as you send those infected bodies over the castle, and you know, that's what it's based on. So anyhow, that show was very popular, and they worked on it, and they used the Barrett title from or the second show up until 1888. 1887 was the last year they did it. And then an interesting sidelight is that in February of 1888, they had an auction of all the surplus equipment as they combined the Barrett show with the Sells Brothers show. And the Ringling Brothers, who still just had a little wagon show at that time, bought their first 2 elephants there. And that's always been, you know, again, a little connection. And the Ringling Brothers actually enter into this story later. It just will surprise all of you, but the last 2 years the Forepaugh Sells Circus was out, it was owned by the Ringling Brothers. Now, here we go. This is, excuse me, it's from 1882, and shows the winter quarters of the circus. And oddly enough, this was a fairly common thing. I mean, there's other circuses that ran photographs of or images of their winter quarters. And again, what they're trying to stress on here is how big the show is. And I really don't, I think this is embellished quite a bit. So, you know, we don't know. There really aren't, there's no known pictures of the winter quarters. We thought for a long time that this was one of the pictures of it. And it turns out a buddy of mine was doing research, and what this picture was taken in 1902. And this was, if you look carefully, you can see the masts of ships in the upper left-hand corner. This photograph was taken in Brooklyn, and which was their first under canvas stand of the season for them. Okay, and now this is an interesting thing. They started in 1881, they had 2 hippopotami on the show, and were the only, up until that time, the only circus to ever have that. Their names were Dick and Babe. And they had an offspring in 1895 who was the first hippopotamus born in the United States, and there he is. And unfortunately, he died after a few days. So, but you know, that's going to be the smallest hippo any of you have ever seen. Now this again, there's a number of posters that have this same motif, and they're all from 1882. And the reason I'm showing this is that still, the circus, the performance itself, still was heavily oriented toward horse acts. And you can see this is what was called a Liberty horse act. They get them to stand up like that and walk on their hind legs and, you know, do other things like that. You know, they say they call it Liberty because the horses were at liberty. They weren't harnessed or anything like that. And this is interesting. Again, this is 82. Lottie Amar was a very famous female rider. And one of the things that, again, a friend of mine wrote this up, is this is a little cheesecakey for the period. I mean, you got to think, this is the era when some people were putting trousers on piano legs, you know, just crazy stuff like that. And this is what there's a genre, there's dozens of posters like this that has what we call the pretty girl on the horse. And this is one of them, and it's a little bit early. She lived forever, and I've got a letter that was written to her in 1947, so she lived up into her 90s. Now, what this is, again, this is called Roman riding, and you can see women started really to take a role in the circuses, including Sells Brothers, in the 1870s and 1880s. And so what you see here is this riding this, doing this riding. There are people, there's some women would do this with like 20 horses, and which is really a tremendous feat. Okay, now this again is another 1882 thing. This is what they called living statues. What they do is they'd have like a hood that would come up and down, and these guys would be in one pose, and then the thing would go down, and the curtain would go down, and then they'd bring another one up, and they'd be in a different pose. And oddly enough, that is still a popular act in circuses. Now, this is something you don't see anymore. This is called leaping, and this was very common. Now, this is absurd. I mean, you can see it. It defies the laws of physics that you could jump over 10 elephants or whatever like that. But the premier artists on circuses were leapers, and there were all kinds of contests to see who could jump over the most elephants, and they always called this Bantu leaping, and you can kind of see it here. There's a platform that had a spring on it, excuse me, and they'd jump on that, and that would give them a little bit of a lift, and then they'd go over these elephants or horses or other performers. And this was a very dangerous act. A lot of guys died doing this, and there were a lot of contests, and it was considered, again, this was a premier act on circuses. Well, in any event, they had a rhino in 1882, and it's called the Big Five of circus animals. It's the rhino, the hippo, the elephant, and Big Four, and the giraffe. And Sells Brothers had all of them, and that really puts them in the front ranks of circuses in the United States. Now, this, again, is embellished. This would have been, by a factor of about 3, the biggest rhino that ever lived. And and it also brings up the point that the vast majority of Americans saw their first elephant, first rhino, and first giraffe, and generally lion and tigers on circuses. Zoos didn't really start until the 1870s, and there weren't very many of them then. That really didn't catch on until after the First World War. So one of the things that the circus was an agency of was for people to go and learn about exotic animals. And there had been a long tradition on circuses of having exotic animals. For example, the first elephant in the United States came in 1796. And one of the things that they would do is there was, up until the end of the Civil War, or the beginning of the Civil War, there was a lot of anti-circus feeling, particularly among the clergy and people, just a lot of Americans. And there's actually quite a bit of anti-circus literature for kids that was published in the 1850s. And basically it comes down to it was a waste of time. You could have been reading the Bible instead of going to the circus. And they also pointed out, and this is true, but it doesn't matter to me, there's not particularly any intellectual content to the circus, or at least there wasn't perceived then. But you look and you see that they saw these animals. That has that certainly would widen their horizons. Now this is again in 1882, and this may not seem so significant, but one of the big manifestations of circuses when they went to the larger tents and the 2 rings and the 3 rings is the clowns had to become pantomime artists. Before that, clowns were basically the stand-up comedians of the United States, and particularly this one a man named Dan Rice was considered just would have been, I don't know, I'm trying to think who would be now, the Dave Chappelle of the 1860s and 70s, and was really an extraordinarily witty guy. And I had a friend of mine that wrote a book about him. He called it The Most Famous Man You've Never Heard of. And but these clowns would, they'd sing songs, parody songs, and then they'd always find out who the mayor was, who was the chief of police, who was the banker. And then they'd have all these stories, they'd make up, some crack that was, putting down those people. There's always been kind of an element, a transgressive element in the circus of, challenging authority, and this was part of that. Now, this again is a lot of people from foreign countries. I mean, you can imagine, except on the West Coast at that time, people, I can't imagine how many people of Asian heritage lived in Ohio in 1882. I can't be many. But this guy was actually a big star, it's Little All Right, and was very famous and a very big performer in the 1880s. Again, this is a photo of the Forepaugh Cells show in about 1900. But again, look at the size of it and the magnitude of it, and think about, you could put the whole field at Ohio Stadium in there. Okay, now this is a later photo. This was taken in 1906 or 1907. If you look over on the right here, you can see there's a fake house is built there. And what they did is they had, oddly enough, in the early part of the 20th century, there were these fire shows that a couple of guys that had been like the chief of police in Kansas City, started them, and they'd build something out of brick like this, and then they'd all come in and they'd put out the fire and all this, and they were very successful. So circuses glommed onto this. And so in 1906, the Forepaugh Cells Circus bought a pumper, a hook and ladder, and a couple of other things from American La France. And they were real fire equipment, and they paraded them. Isn't that interesting? And it's very odd. Now that thing in the middle, you'll see that looks like kind of a ladder there. They would put a car on that, and they would do a loop-the-loop on it, and which is something I would not want to do. This gives you some idea of the magnitude of the interior of the tent. Because of the photography not being as sophisticated or technically good as it is now, there's not very many pictures of interiors of circus tents because there was generally not enough light. One of the things that circuses experienced, like the Cells brothers, was they would publish these books that were called route books, which were kind of like a class yearbook. They would have the route of the show, and then there'd be text of incidents over the season, and then they would list the names of everybody that was on the circus. And you read these things, and it's just, there's just this carnage. There'd be two or three people would be killed by trying to go through between railroad cars a season. There were tents would catch fire. The tents would blow down. There'd be, wind would, they'd have trouble with wind and then rain and just all kinds of things. A lot of animal escapes. And now some of those, you have to take the animal escapes with a grain of salt, because a lot of them came out of the press agent's imagination. They're good for business to do that. And there seems, a fellow named Weisheimer wrote a book called Sellsville 1900. And in there, he had a lot of anecdotal stuff for people. He wrote this in 1971, and there were still some people who were very old then that could remember the Cells Brothers Workhorse. And they all talked about all these animals that escaped. And I just can't imagine there were that many. One of them talks about the 5 polar bears they had for 2 seasons, and 5 and 6 about them escaping. I just can't imagine that. But there was always kind of jokes in 19th century newspapers. They'd say, why is it that the lions and tigers always escape right after the season starts? And so, a lot of this was, again, just PR. Now, some of you are probably not going to be thrilled to hear this, but at the time, it was, American society was obviously quite a bit different in the 1870s and 1880s. There's a guy, really kind of a famous quote that's very helpful to me is the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And that's a good way for me to, at least, to look at history. And one of the things, there was a lot more violence in American society then, and it was not uncommon at all for young guys to get drunk and try to go to the circus and try to get in for free. And this would often lead to fights. And in fact, between 1869 and 1871, 3 circus owners were killed by drunk customers. And so it was always violent. And then there'd often be like a lot of fights on the way home and all this. And it was always noted in the newspaper if there wasn't any trouble at the circus. And it was particularly bad in college towns. And thankfully, one of the worst was Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the other was New Haven. And so there's accounts that you could just see that these show guys, these are these callow, rich college kids. And these are really grizzled guys that are working, these are tough guys that were working for the circus. These kids that start, doing stuff like throwing rocks at the elephants and parade and stuff. And these show guys just come and beat the hell out of them then because they just couldn't tolerate it. But it's an interesting thing. Now, what I'm trying to get to, one of the things was that they would have games of chance that were crooked on lots and lots of circuses, including Sells Brothers. And there are 2 forms that it would generally take. They put this in the Sideshow. And there was one called 3-Card Monte, which would have three queens on it, and you had to pick the Queen of Hearts. And, I don't know how they did it, but it was faked, obviously. And they'd have a shill come up and win. And, it was a very, very elaborate situation what they do to be able to try to cheat the people. The other was called the shell game, which they put a pea or something underneath a walnut shell, and then there'd be, they move them around to try to do that. And but people, there's cases where people lost like $1,000 with this, and they'd have to pay off the police generally to keep the things going. And the Sells Brothers did it. There were really some exceptions. I mentioned this before, but the Barnum Circus never had any. They called this Grift, G-R-I-F-T, and it's kind of a corruption of Graft. And the Ringling Brothers did too, and they never had that. In fact, part of the success of the Ringling Circus was that when they were a little wagon show in the 1880s, they didn't have any of these games of chance, and they called themselves the New School of American Showmen, and they were called the Sunday School Showmen because they never had any of this this gambling on their show. It was so profitable that it was to be able to work these games of the Sideshow. It was called a privilege, and these gamblers would pay the circus like $100 a week to just, to be able to have the right to have these games in the thing. And again, this was not uncommon at all. The other thing that was not uncommon at all in circuses was shortchanging in the ticket booth, and I'm sure the Sells Brothers did that too. Say somebody, the tickets were, they were going to get $1.50 change. Well, they'd put a dollar bill and maybe 3 dimes there, and then have 2 that were a little bit back. In the wagons, the ticket wagon always came up to about here on people, so you couldn't see. So they had these others with a couple of inches late, so they just pocket the 20 cents then. And in that period, 20 cents was about $3 today, so it would add up. So moving along, I'm going to show a lot of the stationery. As you would imagine, circuses were always trying to promote themselves, and they always had really good, really nice stationery. And this is an example from 1887. This is from 1890, and you can see it's an interesting thing because this doesn't happen anymore. You'll notice that the brothers' profiles are on all of these. As far as I know, Bill Gates was never on a Microsoft letterhead, and that kind of thing. Now, this actually is considered by the 11 of us that follow this stuff to be maybe the nicest circus letterhead ever done. This was made off a stone lithograph, and what's interesting in this letter, it's from 1895, after the season. And he says, I've just moved, Peter Sells is writing, the president of the company, the Strobridge Lithograph Company in Cincinnati that printed their posters. And he says, I've just moved to a new house on Denison Avenue, and you please come up and visit me sometime. And of course, we all know that's it. Now that's a picture, look at that, that's many, many, many years ago. And as I'm sure it's right across from Goodale Park, and I'm sure a lot of you know exactly what that is. And there's another good picture of it. And it's a very interesting house. Again, here we're seeing some Asian performers that were on the show. This again is from the Forepaugh cells, and I'll get into that. I probably ought to do that now. What happened is in 1895, the Sells brothers had a terrible season. They lost $61,000, and they basically didn't have enough money to refurbish the equipment and go out in 1896. So James A. Bailey, who at the time was the sole owner of Barnum and Bailey Circus. Again, this is late 1895, and Barnum died in 91, so Bailey owned it clear himself in 95, owned the Barnum Circus. But he wanted another circus to be able to fight off the Ringling brothers, basically, and who were really coming up, and there'd been an awful lot of bad blood and opposition and, covering posters and all this stuff between the Ringling and the Barnum Circus. And so Bailey entered the scene and basically fronted him the money. He took a third interest in the show and let him use the Adam Forepaugh name. Now that doesn't mean anything to anybody now, but Adam Forepaugh was the second most famous showman in America in the 19th century after Barnum. And Forepaugh died in 1890. And Barnum was still alive, and he and Bailey bought the Forepaugh Circus for $160,000, which at the time was the largest sale for any circus in the United States. So anyhow, Bailey, put the money into the show. He let him use the Forepaugh name, which was a real good brand name. And then he also took some equipment that had been on the Forepaugh Circus and put it on this new Forepaugh Cells show. And that's how he got involved in it, and that's how the Sells Brothers Circus became Forepaugh Cells. That they really had a very difficult time in the like 94, 95, and we know some of the financial records of the show in that period, so we'll do that. But this is what's called a tableau wagon, and these people would sit on that, and circuses were generally judged by the quality and the size of their parade. And Forepaugh Cells had a great parade. It was a great circus. And here's another bandwagon, and you see that picture of the eagle on that one wagon, and then there's another one they called Spain that's on the right. And then they had all kinds, people a much higher percentage of Americans could play musical instruments around 1900 than they can today. And this was a clown band. All these guys could play some kind of music. And they'd play off key and, be kind of a parody thing. This gives you some idea of the crowds these shows would attract. And you can see this is on the left there is the Sideshow, and then the big show is straight ahead. And the way these shows were configured, these big circuses were configured back then, is when you paid your ticket to get into the big show, you'd go through the menagerie tent first, where they'd have all the elephants and they'd have the cages with the lions and tigers and so on in it. And so they would open that. They'd have doors about an hour before, so people could spend time in the menagerie looking at the animals. This is a wagon that was called Cleopatra's Barge that came from the Forepaugh Circus but was used on Forepaugh Cells for a number of years. There's a few years ago, WOSU did on one of their Columbus neighborhood series, they did one on Sellsville. And it was to me, it was just extraordinary. They found a film of the Forepaugh Cells Circus about 1902. And one of the things they showed is they'd have what was called tournament at the beginning of the circus, of the show. And all the performers would walk around the perimeter of the rings. And they used, this wagon was actually used in that, what they called the Tournament of the Spect, and that was really kind of a surprise. These are all cages that they would, put lions, tigers, and bears in. And you can see these were mostly, some of these went back to the Sells Brothers Circus that were built in the 1890s, but then they had a new crop of them that was built about 1902. This is the Sells Brothers Calliope, and if you want to be in the know, circus people will correct you if you call it a Calliope. That is, they'll know you're a towner if you say that. So whenever you're with circus people in the future, say Calliope, and they'll think you're okay. And these things, they really didn't make that nice a sound, particularly these ones that were by steam. They're kind of screechy. But what they would do is, because of the noise, people would know where the circus lot was. It was pretty common to follow the parade back to the circus lot. So now here is a good picture of the Sideshow of Forepaugh cells, probably about 1900. And again, you can see, now they didn't have any grift on the show by then. When Bailey became involved with it, that was the end of the grift. But you can, you get a sense of the actions. You can see the midgets there, the little people in the very front, and then there's the giant on the right. And these things, it's an interesting thing. A lot of these things featured people with disabilities, and they call them pinheads and all kinds of things. But people that were of limited mental capacity were very often featured in shows. And the funny thing is you could never show anything like this now as a circus sideshow. But the funny thing is, it's become reality TV is what's replaced the sideshow. And you can just think, you can think about any kind of a thing that was in a sideshow, pretty much, and it's been a reality TV show, like the Little Women of Los Angeles, and there's there's tattoo shows. They had one with kids that were special needs. I'm trying to think what else, twins, all these kinds of things. And so actually, to been again, it's not considered within the profession to call these people freaks is not an insult. But they would actually have pretty good lives, because they would make maybe 25 to 40 bucks a week, which was not that bad. But where they really make money is they'd make a deal. They'd either sell a little paperback, maybe a 30-page, 40-page book about them, biography of themselves, which of course was embellished, or either that, or they had what were called pitch cards, which was little small photographs of them. And it was always, for example, there was a woman that was very famous on circuses named Anna Leek, and she didn't have any arms, but she could crochet with her feet, and of course she sold a ton of pictures because she'd autograph them with her foot. And in fact, it's an interesting thing. When I was doing research for this talk, I was looking at some of these route books that the Sells Brothers Circus published in the 1880s. In a couple of years, the armless guy wrote the route book, and I always thought that was kind of interesting. So, this is the snake handler on the show. This was a lot less dangerous than it looked like. And generally, the women that did this were the wives of the ticket sellers or the orator or whoever with that, and that's how they'd end up doing that. And here's another piece of stationery for the show. And more. I always like this one. You can see they change it every time. Now, this one, again, this is a close-up of that other one that we saw. And what they did when they combined with the Forepaugh show, they put right above, that's Ephraim cells in the middle there, and then they put a picture of Forepaugh up there. And after Ephraim died in 1898, they moved Forepaugh down between Peter and Lewis. That's Peter on my left and Lewis on my right. They put a horse in the middle on the top with that. So anyhow, and here's again, they never missed a chance to advertise, and you can see that from 1895. And then again, there's more stationery. Oh, there's the one with the horse. I didn't realize I had that on here, so that gives you an idea of how they did that. And that's one from 1896, the first year they were together. And again, this is just a close-up of the wagon that was there. And, okay. Again, this is, one of these acts of these living statues that was on the show in the 1890s. Now, this is kind of interesting. One of the things that happened starting in the 1880s is that the big circuses would generally conclude their performance with a bunch of hippodrome races. And they literally would have guys in chariots, and they'd run, go around, and they'd even, this is kind of awful, but they'd tie monkeys to ponies, and they'd run them around with the hippodrome track. I just can't imagine that the monkeys liked that. But anyhow, they would do that. And they'd have a guy would race a horse, and They'd race the elephants. You can see that in the back there. And I might note, too, that Sells Brothers was famous for using, had really good art in their posters. And they worked closely with the Strobridge Lithograph Company in Cincinnati, and they were very thematic. They would use this, this border and then just have a different image in the, in the center, but they were very much thematic, which is a little bit different than lots of other shows. In 1891, after they finished the season, they went to Australia. And there had been 2 circuses, American circuses, that had gone there prior to the Sells Brothers and had been very successful. Well, they got there and they got held up by the New South Wales government. And what had happened is that there was a couple of Australian circuses that got to the politicians and they didn't want the competition from America. So they declared that all their horses had glanders, which is kind of like the horse flu, I guess. And so they were quarantined for like the first 2 weeks they were there. It just killed the business. And they tried to, kind of a strange outcome with that is that at the Columbian World Fair in 1893, they had some kind of exhibit of Australian gold, and the Sells Brothers Circus stole the gold. And oddly enough, the Australians beefed to the US government, so they had to give it back. But they basically got screwed on that. Now, I'll show you something else. You can come up and look at this later. This is Louis Sells' head. It's not real, it's not a shrunken head. And this was presented to him in 1891 in Australia. And it's really kind of, I don't know why I bought it actually, but anyhow, there it is. You can look at it when you're done. And while we're over here, I was telling you about no good photos are known to exist of the, okay, yeah. And you can come up and look at this afterwards. This is from 1887. Yeah, there you go. And that's the best thing we have about the winter quarters is that. And you can see the 2 hippos that are there, and it's a real, that's the most the best image we have of that. Here's another pretty girl on a horse. And this is a woman named Polly Lee that was on the show for about 15 years. And her husband was a guy named Bud Gorman, who was the ringmaster there with that. The Sells Brothers often had very good performers. And as I said, it was in the upper tier of circuses in the United States. And in fact, there were like about 14 railroad circuses that were out in 1880, and of those that made it all through that decade, there were only 3, and the Sells Brothers were one of them. And they also, one of the things that was interesting that they did, I'm kind of backtracking here. This is from 1884, and this will be up here to look at too. And they had a 50-cage menagerie, and they really did have 50 cages. And they were all real short, and they were what was called cross cages because they put them, they'd be 90 or 180 degrees. If the flat car was going like this, they'd put them like that, and you could stack them up a lot quicker with that. They show that. But the other thing I want you to see on here is down here is one of the acts was Butler and Oakley. And that, of course, is Annie Oakley. And this was her first year in show business. Her husband, Frank Butler, had been on the Sells Brothers Circus in 1881 and was familiar with them. But this was the first time that she was ever in the show business. And she went over to the Buffalo Bills show the next year. And, kind of the rest is history. And Annie Oakley is a fascinating figure. She's seen as a proto-feminist. And people like her for that. But she also was a huge gun advocate. And she said every woman in America should own a gun. So now another one here to show is, I mentioned Buffalo Bill a minute ago. And his show replicating scenes from the American West. And again, they were pretty much fanciful. And are considered really racist today and so on, but they were huge. It was a hugely popular form of entertainment, and circuses saw this, and they incorporated Wild West stuff into their performance. In fact, we talked about this Adam Forepaugh circus. When Adam Forepaugh was alive in the late 1880s, he turned his circus into a Wild West show. And there are others that did that. And what the Sells Brothers did in 1887 is they hired this guy named Pawnee Bill, whose real name was Gordon Lilly, and he was from Bloomington, Illinois. But he had gone out and worked with the Pawnee Indians and could speak. He'd been an interpreter and a scout and all this. And he was the real deal. Well, this didn't work out very well. He got in a bad beef. He had lined up a bunch of Indians, and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, I don't know if he didn't bribe them or whatever happened, but he couldn't get any Indians for it. So it was cowboys and Mexicans. And there was bad blood, and he left. And he left on July 18th of 1887, and I think that but anyhow, the day after that, they basically, a lot of the performers left with Lilly, and so Sells Brothers dressed up some of their own people with it. Well, it turned out in Clinton, Clinton, Iowa, on July 19th of 87, they were going around, they were shooting all this up, and they had blanks. Well, somebody got the wrong gun, and they killed 3 people in the audience. And that was a really bad beef for the show. And they skipped the next date, which was in Dubuque, and then they didn't go back into Iowa for years. It's said that they settled for $50,000, but I think that's way too much. And I think I'm actually kind of running out of time. So, okay, here, I'll show you this real quick. This is from the late 1880s. And one thing that's really interesting that happened in the circus is in that period, the performance was geared more as entertainment to children than it had been previously. And this is a manifestation of that, having all these nursery rhyme floats on the show. So, and again, here's some more of this. There's some, we already ran that one. Another one that shows the magnitude of the thing. And that's a good picture of what their menagerie looked like. And there's that. And then this is the Sells show in 1895 in California. This is a guy named Star Kid Chambers, his name was William Chambers, but they called him Star Kid. And he was their elephant boss for a number of years. And he was kind of a low-life guy. I think he had a drinking problem. But when Peter Sells went through a really nasty and highly publicized divorce in 1900, and it was just terrible. And tons of dirty linen got on both sides, got shown in public. But anyhow, Star Kid Chambers said that Lewis and Peter Sells tried to offer him like $1,000 to poison Peter Sells' wife and her lover. So they didn't do that. And they said that, I remember I was reading the newspaper account of it, they said he had a shady reputation. And I can imagine that he did. Now, this is an interesting picture. On the left there is Lewis Sells, and then that's Ephraim in the middle. So that's taken before 1898. This is Mike, who was a big old African elephant that they had on the show. And again, there's another one of these wagons, and that is it. And that's why I went a little long. Yeah.
Fred, what happened to the circus? Where'd you go?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll try to skip over a lot of the details of this, but when Peter Sells died in 1904, to settle his estate, they auctioned the circus off here in Columbus on January 10th of 2005. And at the time, James A. Bailey owned a quarter of the circus, another showman owned a quarter, and Lewis and Peter Sells each owned a quarter. So anyhow, Bailey bought the whole thing for $150,000, and then he turned around and he sold half of it to the Ringling Brothers. So in 1905 and up through about mid-season 1906, the Ringling Brothers owned half of it, and James A. Bailey owned half of it, and the Sells Brothers were out of it. And then when Bailey died, about a month after he died in 1906, the Ringlings they bought his share of the show, and they owned it completely then for the half of the 1906 season and all of 1907. And what happened was, in the fall of 1907, the Ringling Brothers bought the Barnum and Bailey Circus for $510,000, which at the time was just astronomical. The previous largest sale of a circus was $160,000. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of this. And anyhow, the Ringlings, they didn't have the managerial depth to run 3 circuses. So when Forepaugh Sells closed at the end of the 1907 season in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, they shipped half of the equipment to Bridgeport to beef up the Barnum and Bailey circuses with their winter quarters. And the other half they shipped to Baraboo, Wisconsin, which was where the Ringling Brothers were. And that was the end of it. And that's how it went out. And I've mentioned this to somebody before. Now, you know, the winter quarters was between King and Fifth Avenue, and kind of near where the McDonald's is, and there used to be where Columbus Showcase was. Well, when they were laying the foundation for Columbus Showcase in 1924, they were digging in there, and they thought they found a mastodon. And it was, of course, it was one of the elephants that had died and been buried there. So it just faded away. I mean, it left Columbus in the spring of 1907, and it never came back. So I hope that's more than you wanted to know, but that's what happened to it.
Pfening, is it true that Sells Brothers' name was so strong that some circuses used it without permission?
They had Alan Sells, who left the firm in the early, you're getting quite a workout here.
I am, a good thing I wear flats.
Alan Sells, who was the brother that dropped out of the circus in the early 1880s, he had an adopted son named Willie Sells. And Willie was a very talented rider, and he had some managerial ability too. But he really emphasized the name Sells Brothers, or Sells, and he called it in 1891. He had a circus out called the Sells Circus. And then he was with a guy named J.N. Renfro, and they called it the Sells and Renfro, and then Sells and Downs, and then Sells and Gray, and eventually Sells Floto. And Willie Sells was involved in all of these. The Sells brothers filed suit against him in 1893 to quit using the name for the Sells and Renfro show, and he changed the name of it to the New Great Syndicate Circus. But yeah, he's the one that did that. And actually, he died in 1906, and the Sells Floto Circus tried to put pictures of the original Sells brothers on their posters, and the Ringlings got a restraining order against that. So yeah, there's truth to that. He's the one that did it. And you know, I mean, the name, in 1935, the Ringling organization owned 3 circuses, and one of them was called Hagenbeck Wallace. In 1935, they added the name Forepaugh Sells to it, so it was called Hagenbeck Wallace Forepaugh Sells. And so, you know, the name had some staying power. It had drawing power. I mean, the Sells Brothers Circus was a big deal.
Are there any traveling circuses left?
Oh yeah, there's actually quite a few, and they're not doing that badly because people tended to miss them when there were none of them in 2019 and most of 2020. In fact, Ringling Brothers is going to be putting out a new circus here in about 4 months. They took it off the road, I think, in 2018. So yes, there are. But again, circuses are nowhere on the American cultural radar as much as they were 150 years ago or whatever. But they still exist. And one of the things that's happening is there's very few animals left on circuses. There's only a handful of elephants that are used on circuses. And actually that ended up being the death knell of the Ringling Circus. They took the elephants off a couple of years before they closed, and they couldn't believe it when they dropped the elephants. Their income just fell off a cliff. It just killed them to get rid of the elephants. So.
All right, wonderful. So let's give Fred another round of applause.
Thank you.